Yo, it's your boy Logos. And today I want to react to Thomas Sowell and the stuff they don't teach you about colonization. I think it'll be pretty similar to what they don't teach you about slavery, which was a very interesting history lesson. I'm always down for learning more about history, so let's get into it.
Thomas Sowell is one of the greatest philosophers of our time, yet he isn't even mentioned among the 100 most influential African Americans in Ebony magazine.
And I don't think that's just unintentional. People put athletes and musicians and artists and all these other people who don't really contribute anything of significance to society, at least within a profession, compared to Thomas Sowell, who is an intellectual, who is a professor, who is wise beyond his years. And there'll be a crying shame when he does unfortunately eventually leave us.
To help more people learn about him, please consider liking this video and subscribing. To get useful materials about Dr. Thomas Sowell, please visit the website.
Also, I think it's really funny too, as much as the black community says the media and the government loves to manipulate our image, they'll still never consider the fact that certain people don't get coverage and other people do. People like Cardi B and others that be on Love and Hip Hop and other shows that make embarrassment of our community and of our image, they be on the forefront. If it's not them, then it's just athletes or musicians or artists and stuff like that. It's not intellectuals that much. And it's a shame.
Thank you, and let's begin.
Well, you link wealth creation to the acquisition of skills and the employment of skills in a disciplined way, and also in a frugal way in terms of lifestyles. But others would attribute the generation of poverty, the obverse of wealth, to colonialism, imperialism, exploitation, economic exploitation. How do you handle those arguments?
Well, insofar as those arguments are meant seriously, you can simply look at evidence. Insofar as they're purely political arguments, they're saying what people want to hear. Obviously, there are people who would much rather hear that than to hear the other, because if you think that's the problem, then there's not only a quicker solution, but there's a more emotionally and morally satisfying solution. Namely, you fight against the exploiters and so on. If you look at the third world, for example, those parts of the third world where the imperialist powers have come in have typically been the more advanced parts of it. They've been the most prosperous ones. Even if they weren't prosperous before they got there, they became the more prosperous parts. Those parts of the third world that the imperialists have never touched are, almost without exception, the very poorest places on this earth.
So you don't find any explanation for poverty and colonialism? The reverse, perhaps?
Oh, absolutely. That when the Romans, for example, invaded the British Isles, they conquered the southern part of Britain, but they never conquered Scotland. And for centuries thereafter, perhaps for 1,000 years thereafter, Scotland was far behind England in economic and cultural development, because England had the advantage of tying into the whole Roman civilization, and everything that it had created, to some extent, percolated down through the British.
What he's saying is very true, especially about Britain and Ireland and Scotland and how the development contrasts it. Honestly, we talked about a little bit when I did the first part of his Black Rednecks, White Liberals reaction video a few days ago. But what he's saying is very, very true. The part of Britain that was conquered by Rome had access to aqueducts, had access to the form of government similar to Rome, or at least exposure to it. There was many, many benefits of being under Roman civilization. Of course, to get that, you had to be conquered if you didn't want to be willingly part of that. But after you eventually was part of the civilization, there was a lot of nice things that you had. A lot of defensive military things that protected you from people from Scotland, from Ireland, or other invaders, quote unquote barbarians. It's just something that you can't deny. And after the Roman civilization fell in the West, I'm not sure how long, but a little bit after, maybe 100, 200 years ago in the scope of history, people that was alive after the Roman civilization left and fell apart in the West, they couldn't understand how they built aqueducts. They couldn't understand how they built all these marvels of architecture, because that technology and knowledge was lost. That was something that was part of civilization that was kind of bloody, but was also very useful for everybody that did live under it and did enjoy some type of peace for a time.
That doesn't mean the British were happy with the Romans being there. You know, 1,000 years later, Churchill could say, we owe London to Rome, but that's 1,000 years later, and Churchill didn't have to go through what those people went through.
Exactly.
So I'm not saying this is good for the people who were there, but in the longer run, of course, England became what it was because the Romans came. And Scotland finally developed only after England conquered Scotland, and then the culture that developed in England then could spread into Scotland as well.
Well, does this suggest then that in addressing poverty in today's world, there ought to be a latter-day reincarnation of imperialism or colonialism in some form?
No, because I think politically it's impossible. I hear from various parts of some independent nations, they say that they were better off under colonialism and so on. That isn't in the cards. The people who are in the imperialist nations don't want to take on that.
But some would say that there is the functional equivalent of that in the operation of the multinational corporation today. Do you see that, the operation of the multinational corporation, as help or hindrance to the generation of wealth in developing countries?
Well, in those countries, the multinational corporations very often not only pay more money than the local industry pays, but it brings in skills that don't exist and creates industries that never were there before. So that
is very, very true. I mean, it's a good and bad thing because they export these jobs out of developed countries like the United States, France, Britain, other developed countries for the cheap labor they can get in Africa, China, India, Thailand. So it's a good thing and a bad thing. Those people over there get the skills and the money, but us over here lose the jobs and the access to those jobs. And depending on your perspective of it, it's a positive or a negative. It's like many things in life or in history. One person might be like a conqueror and be a hero, but the people he conquered, he seems like the devil or the ultimate villain that you can't wait to die or wait to be assassinated.
To that extent, I think they are a source of the transmission of international human capital. To that extent, yes.
Now, this excerpt is taken from the book, Intellectuals and Race, by Dr. Thomas Sowell. In addition to the inherent geographic advantages that Western Europe has had over Eastern Europe, for example, more navigable waterways leading to the open seas, with Western European rivers and harbors not being frozen over, as often or as long in winter as rivers and harbors in Eastern Europe, due to
honestly, that whole cold, warm harbor is part of the reason why we have this whole conflict in Ukraine right now. But also for the past, few hundred years, Russia has been searching and finding for more warm water ports where in the winter they don't freeze over and they can still have access to the seas. They can't have that in Russia, at least not along the northern border and nowhere near Europe.
to the warming effect of the Gulf Stream on Western Europe, another major historic advantage growing out of geography is that Western Europe was more readily accessible to invasion by Roman conquerors. Despite the ruthless slaughters in those conquests and the subsequent brutal oppressions by the Roman overlords, among the lasting advantages which the Roman conquests brought to Western Europe were Roman letters, so that Western European languages had written versions centuries before the languages of Eastern Europe did. To the enormous advantages of literacy, as such, Western Europeans had the further advantage of a far greater accumulation of written knowledge in their languages, even after the languages of Eastern Europe began to develop written versions, but still had not yet caught up with the centuries-long accumulations of knowledge written in Western European languages. Literacy was not the only thing that moved from West to East in Europe. So did coins, printing presses, castles, crossbows, paved streets, and vaccinations, among other economic and social advances.
It's funny too. This is why history needs to be taught more often in schools, or us as a society need to encourage people to go and learn and read books or just learn about history in general. Because if you did learn history and understand it, you would see all the stuff they just said was true, how everything is tied to each other. Britain got their, advancement or progression a large part from Rome. And Rome got a lot of their inspiration or advancement from Greece. You could see that in their culture and their religion and some of their values too. Even if the Romans didn't always like the Greeks and some of their quote unquote effeminate behavior, they still took a lot from their culture, and that culture eventually led to the Western and the Eastern Roman Empire. And the Eastern Roman Empire lasted a lot longer than the Western Roman Empire, when the Eastern Roman Empire wasn't even stationed in Rome. Of course, that has a lot of factors go into it, but the same people that did conquer Rome eventually, those people led to modern day France, modern day into Italy, and so many other countries that we have now today. And those countries growing and expanding and eventually being imperialists, that led to colonization across the world.
But all of this took time, sometimes centuries. Moreover, people from Western Europe, Germans, Jews and others, were often a majority of the population in Eastern European cities in earlier centuries, while Slavs remained a huge majority in the surrounding countrysides. For example, before 1312 the official records of the city of Krakow were kept in German, and the transition, at that point, was to Latin. Only decades later did Poles become a majority of the population in Krakow. The towns of medieval East Central Europe were often cultural enclaves of foreigners, again, mostly Germans, but with many Jews as well, and, in the Balkans, Greeks and Armenians, joined in later centuries by Turks. In short, there has been for centuries, not only a disparity between the opportunities and advances in the two halves of Europe, but great disparities within Eastern Europe itself, between the indigenous peoples of the region, and the transplanted Western Europeans living in Eastern Europe, the Baltic and the Balkans. Neither genes nor discrimination are necessary to explain this situation, though some intellectuals and politicians have chosen to claim that the differences have been due to race and others have chosen to blame social injustices. Many other racial and other groups in many other parts of the world have likewise ended up with large disparities in opportunities and achievements, for reasons that range across a wide spectrum and cannot be reduced to genes or injustices. Thank you for watching this presentation to the end. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thomas Sowell is one of the greatest philosophers.
My fault, I didn't mean to replay it again. But yeah, like he said, when you have any empire conquering another nation or another peoples, oftentimes it's still going to be the conquering people that's in positions of power, simply because of the fact that they want to make sure that their own people are in control of their own empire. And that just makes sense. Sometimes you will have cases where people that is not, I guess what you would say, native of that empire become positions of power, but that only takes time of multiple generations eventually being conquered and living within that society, like how the Byzantines did. The Byzantines had many emperors and generals, same with the Romans, from across their empire. They had Anatolian, they had Greek, they had Thracian, they had Illyrian, they had Spanish. I can't think of the old ancient name for Spain, but the point is that all these different empires, they only had Romans or the same culture of them being the conquering or people in power, but simply because of the fact that that's who they trusted and that's who was familiar with them. It doesn't have nothing to do with race. It just has to do with protecting what you have, and you want to protect the people that surround you. And most often than not, the people that surround you are going to look like you and be the same culture as you. And if you don't know them, most often you're going to think they're barbarians or savages, no matter if they're black, white, green, yellow, or brown. That's just how history works, and that's especially how warfare works, especially before we started factoring stuff like race, gender, and political stances into history, which it has no real basis for or really no role to play. At least not the way we're trying to use it to try to prove a point politically. But that's just my opinion. It's your boy Logos, and I'll see y'all next time.